Yay.
So enjoy. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, you bet. I'm Scott Madsen. I've been working on this thing for a bunch of years now. Why don't you guys, if you can kind of work your way around this thing, don't, you can fill in over here. You don't have to be standing in the back. Come in where you can really get up close and look at this thing. So how many people haven't heard the story about the discovery and collection of this thing? Anybody in here not know about it?
I do not.
You don't? Well, we'll just talk to you later then.
Okay.
No. No, actually, this quarry was discovered back around 2000 by a geology student named Matt Stykes. And he's a guy from Northern Arizona University doing a geology thesis on the Cedar Mountain sandstone, which is what this came from. Since he's done his work, we've learned that this is about 137 million years old. So it's pretty low in the Cretaceous. So anyway, he was studying the rocks out there, and as he was walking his way underneath this cliff, found some bones that he reported to the Utah Geological Survey, Jim Kirkland, and he said that these things look like a human arm bone sticking out of the rock. And we heard that, and we're thinking, theropod dinosaur. And went out there and with quite a bit of effort found this quarry. Here's a picture of where it came from. The white block there is this block, and you can't actually see the whole escarpment. It's a couple hundred feet of incredibly steep rock. When we first got to the site, the escarpment actually came down right here and clipped off this edge of this block. Very, very steep. You could hardly even stand on, and we had to carve a place to stand. But what you're seeing now is the result of many years of work that occurred after that. I know these are kind of small, but this is the block in place shortly before it was removed from the hillside. And if you guys know Phil Policelli, who was in here just a few minutes ago, he was the guy who actually designed and built this frame that this block is sitting on. We approach this like we did any field problem. You try and reduce things to its smallest size, and you try and take advantage of cracks, places where there are no bone, anything you can get an advantage to make things smaller so you can get them off the hill. This is as good as we can get with this. None of the cracks in here go very far, and if you try and propagate them, force them to go further, all they do is shatter everything around them. And that's kind of why we ended up with an 18,000-pound block. We know that because after we got it down the hill, they were able to take this thing to one of those weigh stations, where they take the semis and everything. They weighed it empty and then full, 18,000 pounds. I've probably removed a few hundred pounds, and we got a ways to go. But like I say, this was the extent of it. The reality of this, here's kind of a couple of views of what the quarry looked like, this being the main block. You're looking at it sideways and on top here. And these other colors represent additional bits of rock full of bone that were actually attached to this. And at some point we realized what we were looking at was a quicksand deposit. If you look at the rock in the field, there's all this sort of gray mudstone that was surrounding this, and then all of a sudden here's this kind of bluish green clay or sand, and that's where all the bone was concentrated. Except it wasn't all here. There was actually what we call a pipe of it. It went down below the block over here and went off to the side. There was another big blob that sat up on top here, and another one over there, and these things were all full of bone. what it represents is basically a quicksand deposit, and you can find similar things in places around Lake Powell and Lake Mead today, out on the big floodplains. And it's essentially almost like an artesian well, where you've got sand and water being forced through mud underground, and eventually it finds some weakness and comes to the surface and sort of bubbles up. And it's, you know, you've seen it in most of these movies. There's always somebody struggling as they're going down into the sand and that kind of thing. It probably wasn't too unlike that, actually. Like I said, the escarpment came down and clipped off this edge of the deposit, but we trenched around it, and actually all the rock that we moved from around this thing was very different from what you're seeing here. So we feel like we actually got at least part of the actual shape of this pit. An artist's rendition of what this thing looked like. This was done fairly early in our work, and we haven't changed our mind too much about this yet. We found iguanodon bones, full-size adult, bits of a sauropod, some larger dinosaurs in here, and you know, it's easy to imagine in sort of a classic La Brea tar pit kind of scenario, you know, where you've got some poor animal struggling in here, and the predators all go, easy meal, and then they go in and they get stuck too. Very possible it happened that way. And one thing that we've noted in here is that there's very little evidence of scavenging, very few, no tooth marks, things like that you usually find in places where scavengers have been at work. However, just about everything is disarticulated. It's kind of almost like a miniature dinosaur national monument, where you might have the occasional complete skeleton here and there, which we haven't found here yet. But you do find lots of parts and pieces. You'll find a leg over here, and an arm over here, and part of a backbone. And we call it semi-articulated. There's a lot of that in here. How did that happen? Well, I think it was maybe a case where you had maybe some animals that got trapped here in the beginning, and sure enough, a bunch of Utahraptors happen along, and they look for a cheap, easy meal, and they hop in there, and they get stuck too. And what happens? They struggle to get out, and if you're in a pit, you know, you're scraping the sides, you're kicking your legs, and if there's already dead things underneath you, you're going to be stirring those up as well. And so that's kind of the picture that I'm imagining here. There's always something that comes along that's a surprise, though, and one of the things that we found on the surface, this appears to actually be a top surface of at least part of this quicksand deposit. And the reason I think that is because there's some chippy looking material in here, and I wish I could find you a good example. The thing is, I remove it as I'm taking it, as I'm preparing the bones, so a lot of that evidence is gone right now. But what we found out after we analyzed this stuff with the scanning electron microscope is that it's actually blue-green algae. It's fossil algae, and algae doesn't usually form in nice freshwater lakes and things like that. It's in bogs and pits and things like that. And that actually kind of fits well with this scenario of a quicksand trap, where at some point there was kind of a stagnant period where not much was happening, and whatever bones were on the surface got covered in scum, you know, this blue-green algae. And I would imagine it wasn't very pretty. With all these animals in here rotting in this scummy surface, it was probably a pretty foul pit. And this is really almost a romanticized version of it. There's no blood, you know, it's very, very clean. I don't think it looked like that at all. What else can I tell you about this block? So as you're walking around this thing, a lot of it's kind of subtle, and it's one reason we've got these side lights on here. You put a shadow on it, and the bones sort of start to pop out a whole lot better, because a lot of it is the bone is very similar in color to the background rock. But as you look at it, things will start to show up, and you'll start to see what's going on. Right in front of you guys there is actually where I started doing the preparation. And I'm just going to come walk around that edge there. You're good. Move this out of the way. So when we got this block to Thanksgiving Point, it was in 2015. And it couldn't fit in these big doors back here. And I had to shave some sides off the thing, and actually on that side you can see right in front of you there's where I cut some of the plaster jacket off there to gain an inch or two over there. I couldn't do that over here. The rock actually stuck way out over here, and I had to remove that. A lot of that was done with a hammer and chisel, and we've got a lot of the pieces that we recovered sitting back there. It wasn't a very delicate or pretty job, but it had to be done at some point. But we got it in here with about an inch to spare on either side of those doors. An 18,000-pound block. It took some reinforcement underneath the floor here, so we're safe. I keep an eye on the cracks in the floor to see if they're expanding, and haven't seen anything yet. And of course it's getting lighter, slowly but surely. Just the plaster jacket probably weighed a couple 100 pounds in itself, and a few 100 pounds of rock have probably been removed off the top of this, but it's a very slow process. Between UFOP contributions and GoFundMe, we managed to raise enough money to buy this microscope equipment that you see here. There's another one over there that's kind of a twin, with the hope that eventually we can have two people working on this. It's big enough that we could do that. But as it is now, I probably spend about half time working on this, and a few hours a day is about as much as I can handle, and everything is done under the microscope. Fortunately, these things are a nice piece of equipment. The real lifesaver is this feature right here. And so the limitations, you think, how are you going to get to the middle of that thing, You're not going to be laying on a platform, and I don't think you're going to be hanging from stirrups or something off the ceiling. That's not happening. But with this setup right here, the biggest limitation is how far I can reach comfortably, and that's about to there, a little bit further. There's another device sitting back there called a bridge, which actually fits between the eyepieces and the body of the microscope that bring the eyepieces out here. And if that actually functioned the way it's supposed to, do you guys have one at the U? If it actually worked the way it was supposed to, I'd be able to have my eyes back here and my arms out here. And that would make things a whole lot easier to deal with. The problem is that the whole thing weighs a ton, and it's old medical equipment, and every time I put that bridge on, the whole thing just kind of sags slowly, and can't have that. So we're still trying to work out some of the problems with some of the hardware here. But my strategy has been to work my way around the block more or less in a circle as far in as I can reach, and stabilize and just kind of do some preliminary preparation on everything I can reach from the outside. And it's taken me, the last couple of years to do that. I've kind of avoided that bump down the end there, because it's just such a horrible mess. Leave that for somebody else. But it's actually worked out pretty well, and so as you're walking around this thing, you'll see about my arm's length here, and it's just jam-packed with bone. And please, do have a good look around here. There's a lot of it's really subtle, but the second part of the strategy is eventually to hopefully find some weakness that we can exploit, or I can move in a little bit, and I think it's right about there. You can see where there's a bit of an indentation in the side of the block there, and that was actually created in the field. We got hopeful for a minute. We actually got a whole foot in there. We thought, oh, maybe we can get through the middle of this, but it ended real fast. But every few inches I can get in this way, I can move around this way. And so if I can just remove enough bone from one part of this thing where I can gain a foot or two in this way, I'll be able to rotate around and do the prep on the middle of it. That's all sort of hypothetical at this point. It's slow work. It's all done under the microscope, every little bit of it. And we're using, I don't know if you're familiar with air scribes. I'm going to slip around the backside here. Just hold up this tool. Here it is. This is just an air scribe, typical little thing, makes an obnoxious little noise, but it does really delicate work. And this is the biggest tool I use on here. It's the HW322, and they're quite amazing tools, actually. I hate pneumatic tools. They all have nasty personalities. They balk and they buck, and they're just nasty. They vibrate. They're not really pleasant to use, but that's about as good as they get right there, I think. You like yours?
The 10's not bad.
Nope.
I love the 10.
You like the 10?
Yeah.
See, and the 10 is almost too violent for most of this. And the reason is all these cracks. You see the whole thing is just riddled with cracks. Most of these were here to begin with. As I said, the cliff kind of came down here, and there were roots and plants and all kinds of things weathering that affected this thing pretty severely. And particularly on that side, right about where that microscope light is hitting, you can see a big fissure going in sideways and down into the rock there. There's bone on either side of that crack. And how do you deal with that? Well, you pump a whole lot of glue in there, and you stabilize it and do a little work on it, and things start moving around again. You put some more glue, you wait. And that's how you deal with all of this. It's just a very, very slow process.
What glues are you using?
Acryloid, if you're familiar with your glues, it's acetone is the solvent, and it's kind of like a liquid plastic. The nice thing about it is that by adding more acetone, you can thin it out. And you can also use it as a contact adhesive. And it's been adequate for this. For really big bones, I might choose an epoxy or some other material, but for these little things, most of these are fairly small bones, it's been adequate. What am I missing here? Did I talk about the algae?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
What are all the little circular
Yes.
markers?
Okay, so I call those targets. I'm sure there's another term for them, but we're using this process called photogrammetry to document the bones in here. The old-fashioned way is basically make a grid, and make a map. We still do that, but photogrammetry, they take millions of pictures, just click, 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 and they feed it into this computer program that spits out a three-dimensional image, and it stitches them together. It's all hocus pocus to me. But you know, the results are really cool. And actually, if you go to the Utahraptor Facebook page, you can see some examples of how this stuff works. And it's they usually use a lot of false colors too, so it makes it look much cooler than it is here. But it's really pretty amazing. It creates this really neat three-dimensional image of this thing. And so we'll have a permanent digital record of where all these bones come from. The other cool thing is that at some point we're going to start removing bones, and this is we're assuming that there's bone going through a good deal of this rock here. We know because there was bone sticking out of the bottom all over the place through here. It's all over the place. The cool thing is that with this photogrammetry and some other techniques, hopefully we'll have this three-dimensional picture of this thing that you can turn around and look at it and see all these bones and how they relate to each other. And I think that'll help us kind of solve the puzzle of just what exactly happened here. I have this idea that these things are all kicking and screaming and trying to get out of here and stirring up dead things with their feet and all that. I could be wrong. But that ought to help us figure things out. Questions? Please have a look around too.